So guys, I've just watched the weigh-in of Joseph Parker versus Razvan Cojanu, which will be contested tomorrow in New Zealand for the WBO World Heavyweight title. Sometimes in boxing, weigh-ins are highly relevant. Sometimes in boxing, they're less so. And I would admit that this is a fight where, realistically, the weigh-in is possibly not as key as some other fights, and I'll explain why. I still think there's merit to talking about this weigh-in, as I still think there's one or two points of interest that came out of it. But I think sometimes in a fight, a weigh-in is absolutely key. Take, for example, Canelo Alvarez versus Chavez Jr., which is being fought at the bizarre 164.5-pound catch weight, and we may well stick a weigh-in reaction video up for that fight after that weigh-in is complete later today. But that is a fight where the weigh-in is key. You know, the huge suspicion is that Chavez Jr. is going to be horribly, horrifically drained in order to make the weight. And if he turns up to the weigh-in looking horribly dehydrated, looking really, really gaunt, looking ill, then those who are picking Canelo to win will be more and more confident behind their picks. Conversely, if he turns up to the weigh-in looking like he's made the weight in good order, then essentially what we've got is a guy who's a lot bigger than Canelo, weighing into a fight where he's going to have a massive size advantage and isn't drained. So that's a fight where I think the weigh-in is absolutely key. Now, you could start by saying for a heavyweight fight, the weigh-in is always less key because they're not actually making weight. However, clearly in heavyweight boxing, weights give a real indicator as to what kind of fitness and what kind of physical condition and shape that the combatants are in. The difference here is with Parker Cojanu, I suspect that the gap in class is so vast that even if Razvan Cojanu turned up in his career best shape and Parker turned up, you know, a stone, 10 pounds heavier than he would normally, I suspect that wouldn't necessarily make the difference in the result of the fight, because the gap in class between Parker and Cojanu seems to be fairly vast. But anyway, I digress. Parker weighed in for this at 125 kilos, which roughly translates as 246 US pounds. If you're talking UK money, I think that's in the region of 17.5 stone, give or take a few pounds. Now that is a very similar weight to how Parker weighed in his last fight against Andy Ruiz Jr. So he's, I guess you could say fairly consistent in terms of his weight. But what's interesting is if you actually look at his career weights throughout the course of his career, those two, this fight against Cojanu and the fight against Andy Ruiz Jr., are by far the two heaviest weigh-ins of his boxing career to date. If we go back to Parker's earlier career, if we take, for example, his 6th fight or his 9th fight, on both of those occasions he weighed in at 226 pounds. So that's a real difference. You know, we're talking about a 20-pound difference, a 9 kilo difference, a stone and a half difference. That sort of difference in weight between Parker's 9th fight and this, which is his 23rd fight. Now, Parker's a guy who's 25 years old, so he's got a big frame, and when you've got a big frame, sometimes it takes you longer to grow into your physique than if you are one of the smaller weights, for example. So it's no surprise that Parker now at 25 is heavier than he was in his 9th fight, where he would have been, you know, 22 years old, something like that. I guess, put simply, he wasn't fully grown into his frame and into his body at the age of 22, 23, like perhaps a lightweight would be. Also, I understand that this weigh-in took place in the evening, which does, of course, have an effect because, you know, people are typically lighter in the morning because they haven't spent the day drinking water and, you know, having breakfast, having lunch, etc. Evening weigh-ins, by the way, you know, that must be an absolute nightmare for the lighter weight classes because they've got to, you know, spend the whole day trying not to put on weight, and it will obviously give them far less time to rehydrate and to fuel up between the weigh-in and between the fights. So evening weigh-ins, probably not something that's going to sit well
with all weight classes, although I would admit for a heavyweight, probably less relevant. But Parker weighed in at 247 pounds, maybe it's 246 pounds was the equivalent. He did look, and I've seen the footage, for me, he did look, without looking fat, you know, I'm not saying Parker was fat in any extent, but he did look decidedly less ripped than I've seen him in the past. You know, he's clearly a powerfully built guy. He's muscular. He's athletic in terms of his physique. He didn't have a sort of ripped out six-pack type look, which you don't necessarily need in heavyweight boxing. Don't get me wrong. You can be just as effective with more of a solid build as opposed to a bodybuilder type physique. But he did look, I guess you could say he looked slightly heavier set than he looked in fights that I've seen him in the distant past. For example, you know, only 3 fights ago he weighed in at 234 pounds. So that's a 12-pound difference, which I guess you could say is a significant difference in terms of a guy's physique, 12 pounds. But yeah, Parker, he looked quite heavy set, and I'd say that's potentially something to watch. I mean, he's only 25 years old, but as he gets to his late 20s and into his 30s, that is something to watch, because Parker, for me, is a guy who is at his most effective when he's fighting a moving fight, and also when he's allowed to let loose fast combinations with his quick hands. And in 3 or 4 years' time, if this increase in weight, you know, he's gone from the 220s in his early 20s to the 230s and 240s in the last year or two. If he's now headed up towards the 250s and he's going to keep going, you know, maybe be in the high 250s to 260s by the time he's in his late 20s, I think that could have an impact on the performances we see from him in the ring. Over time, that may affect his ability to fight a moving fight where he's laterally moving around the ring. It may affect his ability to throw huge number of punches and punches with very, very quick hands, because fundamentally these things are far harder to do when you're, you know, 250, 260 pounds. It's a lot of body to move around. It's a lot of effort to, you know, to generate the energy to do that. But yeah, no, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that there's anything necessarily to be concerned about. He weighed in at 246. Potentially he might have been 242, 243 if he'd weighed in the morning. You know, he's a big guy fueling up the day before a fight, so there's potential for it to have made a big difference there. And he is getting older, as I say. I think the other factor is obviously the Hughie Fury fight was cancelled 11, 12 days ago. Maybe he's, you know, I'm not saying he's undermotivated for this fight at all, but maybe his foot's come slightly off the gas. Now he's fighting one of his sparring partners who he presumably knows he can handily beat. Maybe he hasn't been so strict on the diet or so strict on the training for the week and a half in the lead up to this fight. I don't know. I'm not saying that is the case, but presumably it's going to get harder. It's going to be harder to get up for a fight against Razvan Cojanu as it is to get up for a fight with an undefeated, highly touted prospect like Hughie Fury. As for Cojanu, he weighed in very, very heavy. He weighed in at 275 pounds. In fact, he was the one who weighed in at 125 kilos. I think Joe Parker weighed in at 112 kilos. So I think I might have got that wrong earlier on in the video. So accept that as a correction. But yeah, Razvan Cojanu weighed in at 125 kilos, which is 275 pounds. In UK money, we're talking about a guy who's nigh on 20 stone, high 19 stones there at 275 pounds. He wasn't in very, very good shape. However, if we look at his career, you know, whilst he's been down as low as the 250s on several occasions, he's weighed in the 280s before, he's weighed in the 270s multiple times. His actual last fight was at 282, so I guess this isn't an unfamiliar weight for him. You kind of look at Cojanu, and from the few bits of tape I've been able to see of him, and especially from the weigh-in today, he looks like a very heavy, plodding, slow type heavyweight. And you'd think a guy like Parker's just going to have too much speed, too much snap, too much footwork, too much hand speed, and Parker really should be able to run rings around him from the bits of tape that I've seen. Another interesting thing that I thought was worth taking out of this weigh-in is the height difference. And I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed this. Let me know if you guys felt like it too. But I didn't think the height difference was anywhere near as pronounced as I suspected it would be. Razvan Cojanu is listed on BoxRec as 6'7½", and he's kind of described as a bit of a monster in terms of his height and his, you know, his size and that sort of thing. But actually, when you get into it, and when you actually look at these guys facing off in the weigh-in, the height difference between them, I believe, is actually quite minimal. If anything, you know, Cojanu is the taller man, but maybe there's half an inch, if that. I think Parker is a 6'4" guy. I think, having seen him fight several times, I believe that's a, you know, a genuine weight, certainly. A genuine height even, certainly. But for me, this Cojanu is nowhere near as big as build, which happens more regularly than you'd think. For me, Cojanu looked more like a guy who was 6'5" in there, as opposed to the 6'7½" that he's billed at. And yeah, I think if his tactic is going to be to box long and, you know, to try and use range and reach and that sort of thing, it may be more complex than that for him, because I don't think the size difference that he enjoys over Parker in terms of height is as pronounced as I expected. Certainly, he'll presumably be familiar with that, having you know, having sparred extensively with Parker. Anyway, guys, that's my thoughts on the weigh-in today. Parker looked by far the more athletic of the two. He looked by far the better shape of the two. Clearly, Cojanu is a guy who's been brought in at late notice, hasn't had a specific training camp for this, and you can see there's an athletic difference, certainly in terms of the build in there. Parker's a guy who seems to be getting heavier and heavier as he gets older, and I think that's something to watch throughout the course of his career, because if that does continue, it may have an impact on his fight style and the way he moves around the ring. But against a guy like Cojanu, I suspect that how they've weighed in isn't going to be the main factor in terms of who wins the fight. I expect the golfing class is too vast. I'm expecting an early stoppage win for Joseph Parker tomorrow. I expect him to be able to run rings around Cojanu from a boxing perspective, and I expect him to find the gaps to get him out of there. I'll be disappointed if Cojanu gives him trouble. Let me know your comments in the section below. What are your thoughts on this fight? What were your thoughts on the weigh-in? Were you surprised by the lack of height difference like I was? Do leave your comments in the section below. If you're new to the channel, take the time to hit the thumbs up button and take the time to subscribe so you can check out all of my other videos. We'll certainly be covering this fight tomorrow. I'm intending to do a post-fight reaction video. We may even go live afterwards and, you know, have some a live show reaction. So press subscribe so you can get notified of when that goes on tomorrow. And thanks as always for tuning in.